Going to, you know, I guess in some ways we're going to cover a lot of ground, so I'll dive in. I founded the company in 2009 with one of my partners in the business. I had the idea for the business not long after I became involved in the governance of my own club about 20 miles south of Boston. I come out of high tech. I ran companies. I had my own companies and I ran a couple for VCs in my first 30 years of work. In the last 12, all I've done is work with clubs, study the finances of clubs. We gather data from about 1,000 clubs year in and year out across North America, 49 of 50 states, 5 Canadian provinces. Residential community clubs comprise 23% of the 2019 database that we have that we'll look at today. There's 198 residential community clubs in that data set. I get up at 4 a.m. every day this week. I work 60 to 70 hours a week, and all I do is study club finances, and that's all our company does. Just some patterns that are really important that exist in literally every single club I've been in. You see patterns. I've done a presentation like this. I've been to Moss Creek twice, once in 2016, once at the beginning of 2019. And I've been in front of over 500 different club boards around the country. And that could be the board, it could be the finance committee, or both, or it could be committees in general or members. So some combination thereof. But I've put my feet in over 500 clubs and had an intimate discussion live in person in over 500 clubs that usually takes 2 hours. So the way I try to be a data-driven person, I try to be objective. Everyone in our company is in that same boat. There's no such thing as a purely objective human being, but there is such a thing as a purely subjective human being. Our whole purpose is to try and bring data and fact-based insight to the boardroom table. The most important thing that I think I've seen is when you look across the whole swath of the industry, it becomes very clear that the clubs and communities that are doing extremely well and always succeeding continuously over time do so because there's a process in place where there's a common vision that constantly evolves, and there's an alignment around that vision, no different than any business or country, frankly, and everyone's moving forward towards that vision. There's a whole bunch of misconceptions that exist in the industry. The data controverts them very clearly. I'm not going to cite every one of these, but you can see them on the slides. Anything I speak to this morning, anything that I put forth as a concept that we believe is real, is based on the data that we've studied. I'm only sitting here in front of you this morning for one reason, because of my background or my bearing, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I'll tell the story quickly of how I got the idea for Club Benchmark. Before I became a member of the board of my club, and I was a member of the board for 10 years consecutively and president for the last 3. But before I became a member of the board, I was on the Greens Committee. We were in a Greens Committee meeting, my 3rd one, and we were talking about the budget for the next year. And there were 5 people on the Greens Committee and the superintendent. We were in the room that night. It was in a dreary November night in Boston. And 2 of the 5 of us got into an argument. One said we spend too much maintaining the golf course. The other one said we spend too little. And I watched the tennis match for 20 minutes. And I asked a question after 20 minutes. I'm like, how would you know? Like, I have no idea. How would we know whether we're spending too much or too little maintaining the golf course? We had no data. And one of them said, I got a buddy on the board of Walpole. It's a very similar club 7 miles away as the crow flies. I said, that's great. What's Walpole spend? And his answer was, I don't know how much. I just know it's more. And I literally had an epiphany at that instant because I hang out at my club a lot and I realized we all have opinions, but I didn't think there was much data ever in the discussion. And that was the catalyst for starting the company. That was 12 years ago. I can tell you with all the experience I just cited, that story is not anything but pervasive across the industry. This is a fragmented cottage industry where best practices disseminate slowly, if at all. Our whole purpose is to try and use data to discern and disseminate what we believe the best practices are. When you look at the state of the industry, whether you apply it to standalone or residential community clubs, the industry falls very organically into these 3 buckets. What we refer to as red bucket clubs, yellow bucket clubs, and green bucket clubs. A quarter of the clubs and communities in this industry are in what I would characterize as severe financial distress, and a quarter are growing purposefully. The other half are kind of going sideways. They don't grow, or they grow modestly, and they have an average balance sheet, if you will. We look to the balance sheet in many ways to discern where a club is, but there's other things that are emblematic of red, yellow, or green. Some of which could be the state of the physical assets. Are they fresh and up to date, or do they look depleted and depreciated? Some of it could be that the member experience is lacking. Often in these red bucket clubs, not often, I'd almost say universally, there's always exceptions to rules, of course. But in that red bucket, there's a debate that ensues, and the debate lands on the wrong side of the equation. Clubs don't compete in the end on price, they compete on the value they deliver. That doesn't mean every club or community has the same fees. By definition, they don't. We know that. We'll see that in a minute. But the point is, if you think in the economics concept of making decisions on the margin, the red bucket clubs lean towards cutting costs and managing expenses rather than making the experience better, because we're always evolving. So we're always making decisions annually, roughly, around budgets, et cetera. And the clubs that are in the green bucket are the ones that lean on the margin towards making the experience better on the margin. I'm not saying any community or club should double their dues overnight. And the red bucket clubs, especially since the 08-09 recession, have made the opposite decision, and that's why they're red bucket clubs. Every business, family, organization, community, or club, you could bucket any organization in these 3 buckets. We should all be striving to move to the right. Clearly, it's common sense. When Mike did the introduction, I think I heard him say that there's been some questions of the validity of benchmarking and the benchmarking data, which I understand and I respect, frankly. It's not obvious that there's processes and experience and technology behind what we do. I think what we do, we're really the only ones that do it in the industry. And I get that there might be questions around it. But that concept could bump into another concept, which is also pervasive in every club I've ever been in. And it's this. There's a tendency to want to think that our club is different or unique. In the culture of different clubs and communities, clearly there's a variation of culture. But we're in an industry where everyone's doing the same thing. And when you look at the financial model, and you look at where the money to run the community a club comes from and what it's used for. There's two main ledgers in any business really, but certainly more clearly in clubs. Clubs are capital intensive businesses. But the sources of money and the uses of money on both the operating and capital ledger are the same. It doesn't matter if the club's in Washington State or South Carolina. It doesn't matter if it's a $130 million club like Ocean Reef Club in Key Largo, Florida, or a $10 million club. It doesn't matter if it's the nicest, highest service level club in North America or the most pedestrian club. The sources and uses of money on both ledgers are the same. And that's what allows us to do apples to apples benchmarking in the end. It's important that obviously as board members or finance committee members, we understand there's two ledgers, but it's also important as members that we understand this. The operating ledger is the place where most of the money goes. For those of you in Moss Creek, you've been there some number of years. Some of you have also been in other clubs or communities in your past. And this issue is the same across all of them. The big check we stroke every year is money that's destined to operate the club. It's the money that allows us to run the club day to day. It keeps the grass green and cut, and it keeps the food hot and the beer and wine cold. It's the money we have to maintain and operate the buildings. Someone was just vacuuming in the clubhouse I'm in, to vacuum the floors, to clean the place. That money does not persist over time financially. By definition, it's consumed year in and year out by members enjoying the club. The money that persists over time financially is on the capital ledger, and it relates to the money we need to reinvest in our physical assets. And I will demonstrate this, I believe, conclusively when I get to the balance sheet. It's the money we have to reinvest in our physical assets to keep them fresh and up to date and not look shabby and worn. In your community, it includes miles and miles of roads. It includes water and sewage treatment. It includes pipes running under roads. It includes bridges. It includes buildings. It's a pretty significant capital need. If there's not enough operating money, what happens is the member experience declines and the place just isn't that robust and fun. If there's not enough capital money, then one of the most important financial metric I'll show in a minute, members' equity or net assets declines, and the footprint doesn't expand and the assets become depleted and irrelevant. We refer to what we at Club Benchmarking, what we call the footprint concept. And by that, what we mean is this. You all know better than I, but I've been there 3 or 4 times to Moss Creek. But this is a satellite shot. You all know the extent of the footprint you have, if you think inside the fence, if you will. It's a pretty extensive footprint. Clubs are a high fixed cost business. There's very little variable cost in clubs. No different than the airline industry is an example I like to use. Before the pandemic, every plane I get on, and I get on 4 or 5 a week, they're always flying from hub to hub now, as you know, but if I flew from Boston to Charlotte, let's say, there was 146 people on the plane. Now when I fly from Boston to Charlotte, there's 46 people on the plane. It costs the same to fly the plane. It's a high fixed cost business. Clubs are the same. We have to fund both the operating and capital costs of the footprint. Our business is helping clubs and communities quantify precisely those costs. Where we get into trouble in this industry, and it really started happening after the 08-09 recession, is when we try to cut corners on funding either the operation or the capital related to the footprint. It's particularly problematic in residential community clubs. And by the way, there's emotion in every club. The emotions run higher, in my experience and view, in residential community clubs, because we have an asset that means something to us, our home, that's wrapped up in all of this. You don't have to drive very far on Route 278 up and down, which I've done probably 50 times visiting clubs, maybe more in the last 10 years, to see with your own eyes the communities that haven't properly funded the footprint. It has an impact on their real estate prices. We have a gentleman on our team who's a counselor of real estate. We're in the process of, and it's not easy, and we're trying to do it statistically, of linking real estate values back to the clubs or the amenities and services in the capital and operating ledgers, and to try and discern the statistical link between the proper investment and the improper investment. But I'm thinking of one in particular, community on 278, where they used to have a private golf club that's now public. I think you probably could all guess at least one of them that I'm thinking of. It's not hard to discern what's probably going to happen to the real estate values in that community over time when they do that, and what happens to the sense of ownership and pride of the people who live in the community. And that's all about making poor decisions, trying to cut corners, which we all know. We're all old enough and experienced enough to know there's no such thing as a free lunch. It's just the way it is. To the way we do business, I am the founder of the club. I was the CEO. I'm not. I have a new partner. My new partner, because I frankly want to focus on the things I know I'm good at, and I've been managing people for 40 years, and I'm kind of rather have someone else manage people. We have 23 people on our team. I'm an engineer with an MBA. I'm very precise. It's my nature. And I wouldn't be sitting here if we didn't figure something out 2 years after we started the company, which is how to get data into our database in an accurate and comprehensive manner. We use the same data for our benchmarking as audit firms use to audit clubs' finances at the end of the year. The term used for that is a trial balance. What it is it's an Excel spreadsheet that has every single account in the general ledger of a club with the end of year value in it. And we've got software process people that we refine year in and year out that take each club's trial balance and map it into a standard apples to apples format. We've done that over 7,000 times. I will say, I try to be a humble person, but I also want to be clear, but I feel like we figured it out. Other data that's gathered from most of the gathered sources in the industry come from what we call self-entry data, which is not comprehensive, it's not accurate. I'm not going to get into all the details, it's not the main point, it's just a point. Since 2013, every year we've been selected as the leading data provider to the industry. I've been named one of the top influences in the industry and the educator of the year by Boardroom Magazine, which is the most objective, it's unaffiliated, it's not associated with an association or anything, educational magazine in the industry. And as I said earlier, I've done a lot of work in a lot of clubs. That's just some background. And by the way, I think, Jenny, please refresh my memory. Did you say we're going to hold questions till the end, or we'll take them in real time?
We're going to hold them till the end.
Okay,
otherwise,
thank you.
I'm afraid with you in reference to your time constraints, we won't get through it.
Okay, thank you. So just some background. So in our benchmarking approach, one of the things we learned early is you can't use averages. We have to in a certain case. When you look at a pie chart, it's an average. It's the only way you can build a pie chart. But other than that exception, we benchmark by using what we call a distribution. It's just a percentile ranking. So what you see on this chart on the blue line is the operating revenue from the 198 residential community clubs in our database that have submitted data for last year. Moss Creek on any of these charts will be the large circle. In the number underneath or above it is your own outcome. Because I do this so much, it becomes like, it's literally like learning to speak a foreign language, but I can kind of get the story of a club just by sorting through the slides and seeing where the dots fall. So the variation from low to high, if you look, there's some residential community clubs that have less than 5 million in revenue on the left side. And there's others on the right side that have up to 33 million. Now we only show the 5th to 95th percentile. There are other clubs on each side. We just don't put them on the chart because it goofs up the axis, but they're there. But what we do is we study the variation, and I love doing it, frankly. I just do it all day long. I love studying why there's variation and what drives it, because when you study that variation and you understand what the cause of it is, that's when you begin to understand what best practices are. That's when you begin to garner insight that's of value in terms of governing and managing. So the median club had just about 8.7 million in revenue, operating revenue, and 1.1 million in capital income. Moss Creek was about 11.2 million in operating revenue and $1 million in capital income. There's already a story there on that slide. Ideally, that capital income kind of would be over where your operating revenue is, but you get there a different way. You do get to the capital income you need. We'll show in a minute how you get there. This is how you get there. 90% of the clubs in the industry set the operating ledger to break even, excluding depreciation. You actually generate an operating surplus at Moss Creek. It's in the 94th percentile against those 198 other, or 197 other communities. It's okay, it's not a big deal. It's just that you use your operating ledger, meaning the dues that you pay, to contribute some of the capital that you use for forward-looking capital investment. This is the cost, just the operating dues across those clubs. The median is 10,100. You're at 6,700. If you adjusted that, considering 10% of that is really destined for capital, you're operating your club closer to $6,000 a year. Now, in my past, working with the club, you have a brand, mission, and vision statement, which I looked at 4 a.m. this morning to refresh myself with it. And you speak and think of yourselves in terms of a value community. I would suggest that the data shows that's the case when you look at it relative to the other communities. You are a relatively inexpensive club and community to belong to. That's what you want to be. That's what you're doing. When I was last in front of the board in January of 19, I made this statement, and I'll make it again. Of all the places I visit, if you want to say Moss Creek has unique attributes, here's one of them. You're not unique financially, you might have unique attributes. One of your unique attributes is the breadth and extent of services and amenities your members enjoy. I kind of look at it and think, it's very interesting. You have equestrian, you have a marina, you have 36 holes of golf, and you have fitness, and you have all of the other things that other communities have, pickleball, bocce, et cetera, et cetera. You get all this stuff. I said it to the board in 2019, and I'll say it again because the data makes it very clear. You've got a pretty good deal going at Moss Creek. This data shows the blue line is the operating ledger, so excluding depreciation, It's the operating bottom line divided by the operating revenue, which we'll refer to as the operating margin. The club in the middle, the median club, broke even. As I said earlier, they do that because that's the intent they have. You have a surplus, but your capital income is below the norm, well below the norm. So you use the surplus to combine with the capital income to generate what we refer to as the net available capital, which is the money that's ultimately available that's destined for capital investment and capital reserves. We believe that any club that has a net available capital ratio less than 10%, so this is the total capital, it's essentially earnings before depreciation divided by the operating revenue. Any club that's under 10%, where I put that line, is what we refer to as capital starved. Any club in that 19% territory and above is what we refer to as capital rich. You're kind of in the middle there. But what we know, and I think I just explained hopefully clearly, is this, that given the operating monies that we contribute to the club get consumed enjoying the club and maintaining the club day to day, the key to financial success that's sustainable over time is the money available for capital investment. Because that operating ledger excludes the depreciation, we have to have enough capital to make sure we can overcome that depreciation over time. And there's a metric that we discovered. I've done the research, 20 hours of research. I've looked back before we figured it out. I remember when I had the epiphany coming out of a club in Jacksonville, Florida, to think at and look at the members' equity or the equity portion of the balance sheet over time, because I'm thinking, wait a minute, if a club's not generating adequate capital and they have a break-even operating ledger, their net worth must be declining. You have to have enough capital income to have your net worth increase over time. So we use a club as a best-in-class benchmark, the one on the left, because of the magnitude of the growth of their equity over time since 2004. We go to 2006 for most clubs. They've had a compounded annual growth rate of 8%. That's the top, kind of in the upper reaches of the industry, but also the consistency of it, as you can see. Here's Moss Creek on the right. We think the minimum amount of equity growth is 3.5%. So you're right at the minimum. The upper quartile for the industry is 5% compounded annual growth rate. If you look back to 06 through 010 or 11, I could have probably put that out to 011. Moss Creek's net worth was flat. And if I had the data and I went back 10 years, and we might want to do this at some point, you were probably declining or flat. I'm sure you declined for a long period of time. I'm positive. That was when you as a community and club were kind of going you were on the wrong trajectory. You started to work on capital planning around 2013, 2012, and you started increasing, by the way, through your dues, that operating surplus, you started increasing the amount of dues that members contribute so that you could get your capital reserves going north, and it drove your net worth north. You can see it. Kudos to you for doing that, because if that continued on that same trajectory, you would be getting further and further behind the 8 ball, so to speak. I'm just reiterating the purpose of the operating ledgers and the capital ledgers. We have to keep it in our minds as members. The operating ledger funds the member experience. If we don't have enough money for it, then the member experience declines or is not compelling. The capital ledger funds our long-term sustainable financial success. And if we don't have enough capital, our assets will become depleted and depreciated over time. Part of the epiphany we had on members' equity made us focus on the balance sheet as opposed to the income statement, which we really did for the first 7 years of the company's life. For the last 5, My efforts and our company's efforts have been on the balance sheet because of what we've learned. We began doing capital reserve studies. We actually bought the leading company in the industry because we knew it was so important. We've quadrupled the size of that company since we bought it at the end of 2017. We put $1 million into a software platform to help clubs turn capital planning from an event that typically happened every 3, 4, 5 years, if it happened at all, into a process that never ends. So we have a platform that allows clubs to continuously monitor and plan for capital because it's the most important thing we can do financially. By the way, the best analogy I can come up with is this is no different than owning a home. We want to maintain our home and keep it fresh and up to date. Not everyone does that. You could drive around Moss Creek. Some homes are impeccable. Some homes are dilapidated. It's got to do with planning and setting aside the money and knowing that we have to operate the house, keep the heat on, keep the cooling on, keep the place clean, cleaning supplies, cleaning people, and we have to have money set aside to replace the roof when it goes, or to replace the dishwasher when it goes, or to replace the tile in the bathroom when it becomes cracked and eroded. It's the same thing. The metric that we use to evaluate at a very quick level, but very accurate level, how well a community, a club is doing it, replacing its assets, is the net to gross property, plant, and equipment ratio. It's a little technical. I'm not going to get into all the gory details. I'm happy to if someone asks a question. There's over 700 clubs on this chart. The median is 46. Moss Creek at the end of 2019 was 35. I've been there since 2016, as I said, and you've been hovering in the mid-30s. We must drive this to the right. Every year, there's a battle that occurs, and I use that term figuratively. Depreciation pushes this ratio to the left. Capital investment pushes it to the right. We give a green dot when it's 55% or higher, and we give a yellow dot when it's between 40 and 55. And if it's under 40, we give it a red dot. So we have some work to do at Moss Creek. This is why the balance sheet's so important. On the right side, equity, the net worth or the book value of the community is 70% of the balance sheet. At Moss Creek, it's 75 because you have less debt. If you look down below, the average debt to equity ratio is 20%, you're at 8%. But when you look to the left side of the balance sheet is when things get interesting. At the average club, 80% of what the club owns, which is the assets, is the net book value of property, plant, and equipment. Half of the clubs in the country, their net worth is declining after inflation, which means their asset base is declining and their assets are declining. It'd be like giving your money to an investment manager and calling them up 10 years later and say, how much has my money grown? And they tell you your money has shrunk. It hasn't grown. You're not in that case. Yours has grown, but you're only growing because of the decisions you made in 13 and 14 to increase the capital contributions. So you've started heading in the right direction. If you add one more line item, you get to 90% of the assets, that's cash. At Moss Creek, you have more cash on hand, more reserves, if you will, than the norm, but you also have a lower state of your asset base. So that cash, as we all know, is ultimately destined to be reinvested in capital to help move that, that dot to the right, okay? So that's a pretty significant, what I'd call strategic review of Moss Creek's finances. I'd like to shift a little bit for a few minutes to talk about the way I look at the keys to success. I'm going to state it again because I can't overstate it, because people are moving in and out there every week or every month, and we forget these things. But we as members must realize that the operating ledger drives the experience. As I said, you have a significant array of amenities for a relatively low price. If I owned that place, or if I owned a house in that place, what I'd be advocating for is on the margin, meaning when we're making our budgeting decisions every year, incrementally, let's drive the experience forward. Let's not try to make our lower quartile price point lower. Let's try to make our experience on the margin a little better. The second point is the capital ledger is the root of financial sustainability, period. And the third point is this: capital planning is a never-ending process. It's not an event. I know from some discussions with John and Payman that you've done reserve studies with different companies over the last few years. We're in this business. I know who we compete with, and I know what the process is of doing this work, okay? Being an engineer, having been trained in the concept that you have to cite error bands, nothing's perfect. You know, when people build bridges and they say that there's no chance that the steel that we put in the bridge will vary from what we think it will from a strength standpoint, bridges fall down, i.e. Minneapolis. Poor design. So reserve studies are similar. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our involvement in the work we've done for you. We had 3 people at Moss Creek for an entire week. I talked to the team leader this morning for about an hour about what you've done there. We've done there. They worked about 40 or 50 hours each that week on site, 120 to 150 man hours. Since then, they've put 100 hours into completing the report that we have recently delivered to you. We're also about to start a process with you that we call a capital strategies modeling process. And this is the $1 million platform I told you we've developed, and it's going to just keep evolving over the next 10 years. But it's platform-based. We don't look at this as an event. We look at it as a process. The platform allows for ongoing capital planning. We take a 10-year view. The capital reserve study is a 20-year view. The capital quantification of the numbers in terms of what you should be contributing versus what you're going to consume in capital investment. We look at a 10-year view because you have to project forward things like how many people are going to leave the community and enter, so you can project forward transfer initiation fee income. There should always be a 10-year view. Our platform is designed to add the 10th year on every year. Close out the current year, add the 10th year. We don't want to. I hope we don't. If you keep doing business with us, we're not going to come and go. We don't do these things one-off. We develop partnerships and evolve the data over time as it needs to be. We want to help you keep your assets in the right condition, and we want to make sure there's always a live and accurate view of your future needs and resources. And our view, it's just our view, is that we'd like to do it in a proactive manner so that assessments don't drop out of the sky because of poor planning. There's 2 types of capital: obligatory capital and aspirational capital. Obligatory capital is the focus of the capital reserve study. It's the repair and replacement of the assets we already own. Aspirational capital is expansion or addition to the assets that we have. If for some reason you decided to take the pool out the pool you have out, and make a huge resort style pool, whatever. I'm not saying you should, but if you did, that would be basically aspirational capital. If you decided to add a 9-hole executive course, that would be aspirational capital. We think that obligatory capital should be funded in real time as it's consumed by the members so that deferred maintenance doesn't build up over time, as has happened in 3/4 of the clubs and communities in the country. 3/4 of the clubs and the communities in the country are not generating adequate capital. We're on a mission to change that. If you, just to meet obligatory capital, we believe the members' equity needs to grow at 3.5% a year. Members' equity, or the net worth of a club, is a leading indicator of a club's ability to meet its future capital needs. When your members' equity was flat, you were not generating enough capital to meet the future properly. As it started to increase, you've begun to do that. The reserve study we've done has 753 line items in it. It's a big number. It's 54 million over 20 years. Your depreciation last year from your audited financial statements is 1.6 million. I'm going to look at those in a minute. I'm going to share those with you. There's a couple of points. Depreciation, or meeting depreciation, is not adequate for two fundamental reasons. One, depreciation represents what we paid for things in the past. When we replace them in the future, they will obviously be more expensive. Two, every club and community, including Moss Creek, I think you were built originally in the late 70s. In my head, I'm thinking you're a roughly 40-year-old community. There are assets in your community that are fully depreciated that will eventually need to be replaced. Those two reasons combine to make it in a, just a very high level, common sense manner, obvious that we need to probably be investing in the future more per year than we are depreciating today. So we are about to embark on a process where we're going to do with you the 10-year forward-looking capital model. And frankly, I think it will, align various perspectives, because that's the whole point of data. And as Dwight Eisenhower said, plans aren't important, but planning is. The process of planning, and I'm going through this literally with 3 clubs as I speak. I got to jump on a capital modeling process with another club after I finish the presentation, after I finish yours. So we see this. We're doing it with not one community or club. We're doing it with many communities of clubs. We get to learn. We get to apply what we learn in different places. We get to see the kind of the spectrum and apply it to the betterment of all. I'm just going to show you real quick something. But I think I have to change the thing that I'm sharing. So this is your 2019 audited statements. Your gross property, plant, and equipment, excluding the land, because land doesn't depreciate, as you can see, is about $37 million. It's 38, you take the 2 out for land, you got 37 million. Your accumulated depreciation is about 24 million, and your net PP&E is about 15. That 37 million of gross property, plant, and equipment in the future will have to be regenerated. But the 37 million represents what you paid for it in the past, or what it cost in the past. It doesn't take a lot of thought to realize that what we're going to regenerate in the future is going to be more expensive. I'm just trying to give you an order of magnitude. And I'd also like to say, frankly, hopefully open everyone's eyes to realize how capital intensive these things are, clubs and communities, significantly capital intensive. So those are your own numbers. Club benchmarking has nothing to do with those numbers. Your auditor gave you those numbers. It's a big number. I'm pausing for effect. Now we got to share stop this and share the other screen and go back to the presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to work to develop, and this is only one piece of the puzzle. It is not meant to be looked at yet. We've already started the work, but we're going to fill out this template by doing detailed work with our capital reserve study and with you, so that we have a 10-year forward-looking capital model that will quantify precisely your forward-looking needs and your projected forward-looking resources. And then if there's a gap, that we close the gap starting today rather than waiting till the future. There's no sense in waiting till the future and getting an assessment out of left field or not having the money you need and letting the assets deteriorate. I've been in almost every residential community from the time you come off 95 till the time you hit the ocean in Hilton Head, in that area, literally. I've seen them, I've been in them, I've walked through them. I've done presentations at many of them. All you have to do is walk in them and see which ones are kept up to date and which ones aren't. I get that you're a value community, but a value community doesn't give you the license to not reinvest to keep the place so that it doesn't look shoddy and dilapidated. I'm guessing everyone would agree with that. So in terms of this process, our vision is to work with you continuously and other clubs, and not to come and go every few years. I've learned, this stuff didn't drop out of the sky. Like when I talk about the epiphany I had regarding the importance of the balance sheet, assets, capital planning, my view of it is that came from flying around 150,000 miles a year, spending 150 nights in hotel rooms and visiting 500 clubs and having discussions and looking at the data all the time. It didn't drop out of the sky. These concepts I just enunciated, they're new. They never existed. No one ever looked at net worth over time before. We figured it out. It's all important. It's all new. And it's all a result of backbreaking work, to be frank. And I'm hoping that you embrace it and not shun it, because it's real. Look, I have to say this because as Mike said in the introduction, I get it. I'm 62 years old. I get that there's different viewpoints. I get that there's different perspectives. I literally created the company because I'm a consensus-oriented person, and I wanted to use data to align people. I used to get sick when I was governing my club, involved in governing my club. I've lived through contested elections. This isn't theoretical to me. This is real to me. There's lots of opinions in clubs and communities. And some folks, in my view, it's about 10 or 15 or 20% of the communities or clubs think they have the answer and they're not shy about it. It's not, we can't yell at each other. We can't debate with each other. We need to use data to align ourselves. That's the whole point. I've come to a conclusion that it's almost impossible without outside objectivity to get this straight in clubs. That's an opinion. I admit it. It's just my view. I believe in the end, it's all about data, all about continuously learning and improvement. And in the end, it's all about capital investment that never ends. And I guess I am finished. I have a couple other metrics. I'll say this, there's a context issue here, and I'm not speaking out of Moss Creek specifically, I'm speaking across the industry. There's two contexts that come to bear in clubs from the board level and the membership level. There's something wrong. It's kind of like what happens in our political environment. It's the same kind of debate. One is the something's wrong context. The other one is we're in this together context. I personally believe that data is the way we bring these two perspectives together. And that's our mission, is to work with you. We've been doing it. I'm going to reserve what I had in my head for questions, but I've been in the community enough. I've been in front of the board twice. I have a sense, I think, of the community, and I have a strong sense and belief because I've seen it happen in other places, that if we all just say, let's use the data, let's let the data drive the discussion, let's let the data drive the decisions, we'll actually be better off. So with that, Jenny, I conclude.
Ray, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And Ray has agreed to take questions. We will start with questions from the board. So as board members have questions, just raise your hand and then come off mute so we don't all talk at once. Rob, I see yours first. Come off mute, please.
Yeah, good morning, Ray. Hey, I just wanted to thank you very, very much for taking your time and explaining this to us. I've heard the presentation previously, but I got to admit, you gave us a whole lot of new information that we didn't have before. The use of the term residential community club, that was new to me. I've not heard that. And the fact that you brought up that we're compared to 198 other residential community clubs, that's huge. What I want to ask you, though, is that you presented very succinctly good financial KPIs. What I want to ask you is, what do we do with that data? Because now we have to take that, internalize it, and we've got to develop other KPIs which balance it against member experience. For example, you brought up the point that, you know, Moss Creek has really got a lot of breadth and depth as far as amenities. How do we know we've diversified too much and we're trying to maintain too much? How do we develop those KPIs?
So, great question. First off, a few points, please, Rob. Number one, you're right on the money, so to speak, when you talk about member experience and measuring that. I have a new partner in the business. I had mentioned this at the outset. I was a CEO. I have a new partner who is the CEO. The partner I have who is the CEO was a club manager for 35 years. He's a very unique individual. He has an undergraduate degree in chemistry, an MBA, an agronomy degree. He's a PGA golf professional. He's a certified club manager. I'm doing this for a reason. He's a certified community association manager. And when he was 54 years old, he got his PhD studying member satisfaction from Iowa State. He joined us because he loved the company. He was running and built Gray Oaks, which is a residential community club in Naples, Florida. And he was managing that, and we became friendly because he was a customer. And one day he asked me, Ray, when I get my PhD, I wouldn't mind being involved in what you do. I'd like another 10 years to do something different than being a manager. So we started doing member satisfaction studies based on his research. And we've done it now with over 80 clubs, many of which are residential community clubs. And we're learning every day. And to your point earlier about the evolution of the presentation, it's just a statement, is what I said at the end. We're continuous learners. That's the way we run things. So you're right. I learn something every day, literally. What we are in the process of doing, and we haven't done, but we've done it, let's say tactically, not strategically yet, is trying to link the financial data to the satisfaction data. But what we know from his research and from the 80 clubs we've applied his research at to this point is this. One of the critical attributes that relates to, let's say, member satisfaction, I'm using that term a little bit loosely, but let's use it, is what we call motivation. This was what Jim, my partner's research was on. Why do people join or move into a particular residential community? And why do they join that one versus another one? And how does that motivation relate to their satisfaction? His research kind of demonstrated, I'd say proved, you could say, because it's all statistical analysis and regression, that there's a significant link between why you went into a particular community and how satisfied you are. In our satisfaction surveys, not just measure satisfaction, we measure motivation, attachment, loyalty, satisfaction, and value. There's an equation that links those together. And that's what we do. We haven't done it at Moss Creek, But our vision for our company is all this data is in one database and we can correlate it one from the other. Right now, it's islands. We're bringing it together. So I agree with you 100%. You can't look at the financial data in a vacuum. You have to look at the satisfaction data as well. Our view is that can't be looked at in a vacuum either. It really needs to be benchmarked just like financial data does, because in a cottage industry, if you don't have context from other clubs and communities, you don't have anything. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Thanks for the question. Thanks, Ray, for the answer. Who else has a question on the
I have
board?
a question.
Go ahead. Is that Bonnie?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
Bonnie.
Bonnie, please.
Ray, you have given us a great deal of information, and I very much appreciate it. My first, and I guess I've had several questions during your presentation, but I'll just figure out what I can remember from it. First of all, the residential community clubs, are all of those homeowner associations and not private clubs?
There's a spectrum. I'm sorry. Did you look like the Wi-Fi kicked out there? Do you want to keep going? I didn't mean to interrupt.
The question was, are what you term residential community clubs, are those private membership clubs where you can belong to the club or not, but you happen to have a house there, or are they all homeowner associations, nonprofit?
Right. There is a mix in the 198, Bonnie. There's a mix. There's a spectrum, as you know. On one end of the spectrum, what we refer to as bundled communities, which means the only way you can be in the club is if you own a home or a lot. And everyone pays the exact same amount. There's only one category of membership, if you will. And that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, there are residential community clubs, to your point, where not everyone has to join. There's also residential community clubs where, well, let's say there's a variant where not everyone has to join, but the only people who can belong are people who live in the community. And then there's another variant where not everyone has to join, but people from outside the community could also belong. So 198 includes all of those variants.
Okay, one of the concerns, I guess, that a number of people have had is since Moss Creek really is a unique community, we feel very strongly about that. How many of that variant, how many of that mix do you think is like Moss Creek in that we are an HOA?
Well, in the 198, my sense, I can give you the exact number, but I'm doing it off the top of my head, but my guess is it's about 20 to 25% of those 198.
Okay, great.
And I'm guessing that guess will be pretty close to the reality when I look at it.
Okay.
But if I may, when you say Moss Creek is unique, and if you look across that variation, back to the earlier point I made, I'd say that this is the case. Whether it's a bundled homeowners association, as you say, or one of the other variants, I could be wrong, but my read of it is that the key to financial success over time is the same in both types.
Okay.
And it's the same as it is in a standalone club, which is recognizing the operating ledger drives the experience day to day, and the capital ledger drives the financial outcome over time. That's the most critical point.
Okay.
And I don't think the configuration changes that.
Okay. It looks like from your data, we probably fit in the green bucket based on all the definitions of that. We're doing great. People are, think like we are members. We don't just think like members. One of the things that I think we have a challenge here in Moss Creek is the information or the guidance that we get from club benchmarking tells us we need to spend. We need to spend on our amenities. And that message, I think, has been heard very loudly and very clearly by prior boards. And that's gotten us into some division within the community. What I hear you saying today is spending doesn't mean building new things. It means maintaining your infrastructure equally, because that also drives up your members' equity, correct?
Oh, yeah, a couple of points there. It's a very good question. As I showed the slide that shows two types of capital, obligatory and aspirational.
Yes.
The more mature a community is, I think you could pretty much, by definition, say there'll probably be on the margin less aspirational capital than there will be in a newer community. Okay? But I don't think aspirational capital ever ends. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you a very good example. Pickleball. I didn't even know what the heck pickleball was 5 years ago. Now pretty much every residential community has pickleball. So society changes. And when you think about your community, if you're thinking forward and you think you're going to be there for 10 more years, let's say, I'm just throwing a number out. The people who are likely to buy your were to leave, are very different in terms of their own desires and wants than it was when you or I would have moved in to the community 10 years prior, right? That 20-year shift, there's a very big shift in what the person coming in wants and desires. This discussion, I was on the phone yesterday with one of the larger gated residential community clubs in Florida, and they're going through this metamorphosis right now. The people that are in there, the average age is 78. And the people who are beginning to buy, the average age is 58. And there's a big difference between what the 78-year-olds want and what the 58-year-olds want. And that tension, I'll call it tension because I think it's an appropriate word, is this. The 78-year-olds more likely than not happy with what is there. And the 58-year-old more likely than not wants something that probably isn't there for that very reason. So aspirational capital will always exist, even in a mature community. It might not be as significant in dollars, but if I may, at Moss Creek, if I may, I'm not critiquing you, but if I were to apply what I've learned by visiting all these other ones, there's things that others are doing that you may eventually do or you likely do, let's say around the food and beverage experience, for example. So I would never suggest to anyone that every community is going to have the same aspirational spend. That doesn't make any sense. But I would also never suggest that any community is never going to have aspirational spend, because that wouldn't make sense. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yeah, it does.
But if I may, one more thing. The plan that we're going to do with you includes both obligatory and aspirational. That's the beauty. Plan for it ahead of time.
Thank you, Ray. And Bonnie, can I come back to you for further questions? Because I think we're getting tight on time and some of the other board members also have questions.
Thank you, Jenny.
So hang on to it. Barbara, I see your hand up.
I have two quick questions. And Ray, I'm Malcolm Baldrige trained, so please excuse, okay? Just so you know.
Hey, I love it.
Okay, all right. No, I know. One of the things in benchmarking is to look at processes. And I think because, there are so many people who do similar functions within what benchmarking does, do you also look, I think you just kind of mentioned that you mentioned food and beverage, and do you ever give input then perhaps what other places are doing to help with that particular sector?
It's a very good question, very interesting just because of the timeliness of it. Our company is growing rapidly, I think because we're making a difference, frankly. We're on the verge of deciding whether we're going to get into stuff like that or not. I don't know is the answer. I know how we might do it. We don't do it now, but we might do it.
Okay, I just wanted, and my last one, in looking at, I understand about the capital investment and I understand the need for that and everything. And I think data is a driver. But I also think that in looking at financial completely, I guess I'm a little curious why. I understand capital is one piece of the problem, not, I don't mean problem, but, challenge. But also then why operating is not also included in that? Or does that come up in a different process?
Say that again, why operating is not what?
Why you don't include that in the whole financial picture?
Oh, we do. I showed you the operating revenue and the operating margin.
Correct, but you said that the driver is capital investment, reinvestment.
Yeah. No, what I meant to say, I might not have been clear enough, was the most of the money is for operating the club.
Right.
But that money is specious. It doesn't persist over time. It's consumed operating the club.
Right.
So it doesn't drive a financial outcome for that reason. The financial outcome is driven on the capital ledger.
Okay, but also.
That's what persists over time.
Yeah, I got that, but also it does have an impact on the owners in that they contribute, through their dues, through their revenue, through the certificate fees and so forth. And I guess I was just looking at the whole picture is all.
Yeah, and so to your point, the certificate fees, that's capital, what we would call capital. The operating surplus of 10% that you have is ultimately really capital as well. So the roughly $6,700 you pay a year, about 10% is really money that is going to capital because it isn't being used to operate the club.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then just one more thing, if I may, because I know you're on this. The epiphany that I had to learn it. I didn't know this until 5 years ago, but it was a real epiphany. When I look at the operating ledger now, because of what we've learned, I don't look at it as a financial thing. I know finances are involved. I look at it as the member experience. That's the way I think of it. That's the way I think we should all think of it. Because it isn't really about finances, it's about operating the club and driving the experience.
Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Thanks, Ray. Who else has a question from board members? Speak up.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, you're back on, Bonnie, go.
All right, that's great. Ray, you say basically operating expenses, they're consumed and it translates into member experiences. Okay, I get that. How could we tell if we're not managing our operating expenses very well? Is there any measurement to give us an indication on that?
There's two things I would cite there. And just to be very clear at the outset, my read of it is that, I'm going to be blunt, okay? I believe if I owned it, if I were an owner, I'd be advocating to spend more in the operation. I think you could drive your member experience on the margin. I think you could drive your member experience forward. That's my own read, okay? That doesn't mean it's right. That's what I see. But 2 points. We've done the analysis. You remember I mentioned clubs are a high fixed cost business. Our estimate is that about 8% of the operating expenses are impacted by efficiency. Okay? So it's on the margin. I'm not going to say there isn't some efficiency in the equation, but it's not efficiency that drives 92% of the spending. It's the choices we make. For instance, I'll use food and beverage as another example. Your subsidy of F&B is 10% of dues revenue, which is the exact median for residential community clubs, okay? If you decided you didn't want to subsidize F&B by 10%, you wanted to subsidize it by 5%, the way you would do that is to shut the F&B operation down in hours that it's operating now to save the expense, because the expenses are fixed. On the margin, 8% could be attributed to efficiency? My view of it is this, that the management team is responsible for the 8%, and the board focusing on the 8% takes the board into operational governance instead of strategic governance, instead of creating and implementing. I looked at it this morning at 4:30 in the morning, your brand and vision statement. I sent John an email. I said, is this still real? The board should be thinking about the 92% and should be wondering, in my view, back to Rob's question, are we delivering what we believe is a member experience that meets our mission and vision? Rather than worrying about whether we're spending 8% too much for what we get, which is the efficiency piece of the puzzle, according to our data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And the next question would be, well, in what area? How do we do that? And I guess that's internal, and that's kind of how we got into trouble with the spending on assets and not, you know, such as that. So I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Well, you have to do both, but I think the answer to that last point, or the retort to that last point is what Rob said. I think the measure of member satisfaction,
Yes.
and the ability to put it into context relative to other communities and clubs is really important.
Okay. Thank you, Ray.
And one more point, please, Bonnie.
Okay.
Just dawned on me. It's not the static number that matters. What matters is it improving over time?
You're talking expenses?
No, satisfaction. Do we keep
Oh,
improving?
satisfaction. Yes. 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 Got it. Thank you.
And then I can't help myself and make a third point.
Go ahead.
What I think is probably not unique about Moss Creek is this. If there's a dialogue or debate ensuing between spending a little more money and making it better or not, that when we do surveys, we do them based on age, tenure of membership, gender, et cetera. We bring all the demographic data in, and we've done it 80 times. And I can tell you from the data that the tension is that the older, more tenured members don't want to spend any more money, and the younger, less tenured members want the best experience they can get. That's the tension that exists in all the communities we work with, and I'm guessing it exists at Moss Creek as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, other questions from board? Rob, I see your hand up.
So Ray, in Club Benchmarking's presentation on your website, they made an interesting point, and that is asking what another club or another community has as far as fees and trying to compare one to the other is a really bad question. Would you mind explaining that a little bit for everyone?
Yeah. What I think I don't know exactly which, we got a lot of material, as you know, on the website. So, but what the point is this, if you just compare dues, the amount and nothing else, that's a very, very foolhardy comparison. You have to compare the dues, the number of members, and the dues revenue. Ultimately, it's really dues revenue that you should be comparing. Then you have to look at where's that money going in terms of the member experience. So I think the point we were trying to make is, don't just take 10 communities and say, here's what everyone's paying to belong without the rest of the data, because you'll get yourself in trouble.
Thank you.
Other questions from board members? Speak up now. Okay. All right. Ray, tell us how much more time you have, because we have several questions from observers.
I have, excuse me 1 second, I might have I might have to move, but I may have more. Chris, you want to start? Can you start? Okay, you start. Yeah, I'll come back, absolutely. I'll tell you what, my associate's going to start this presentation instead of me.
Oh, great.
And I'll move to another room, which will give us another 10 or 15 minutes, all right?
Okay. And let me ask you a question while you're moving. Would you be willing to have this presentation, because we've had several requests for this, may we post this on our website so other members may see it?
Yes,
Thank you. And for the questions we can't get to today live, would you help us answer them via email later?
100%. We do that all the time.
Great. Thank you. All right. We'll give you
So-
time to move.
I'm just gonna find another place so I'm not interrupting the meeting that's gonna start. Which means I gotta put my mask on too.
There is an advantage to Zoom, no masks. Okay, so to our observers, go ahead and put your questions up. If we can't get to all of them today, we will get you an email answer. So please understand that. And you heard that Ray said he would help us with the email answers. And I've noticed that some of the questions seem to be overlapping. So in those cases, I will combine them and ask them. And I have to tell you again, if you're making
Appreciate
statements,
that. Thank you.
we're not going to read statements. We'll just read questions that,
Okay, thank you very much. It'll only be 10 minutes.
the rest of them will handle by email.
Thank you. Okay, sorry about that, folks.
No problem.
I've now been moved to a corner of the clubhouse. So I have a
Okay.
different background.
Okay. All right. So there's a question from Dale Todd, who's a member of the Finance Committee. I want to make sure we get all the Finance Committee questions in if we can. How do we educate our members to think like owners and focus on building their own piece of financial equity? For example, how do we change our behavior to look at food and beverage and other amenities as an amenity and not in terms of profit and loss?
I think you do it through data and education. That's my view.
Okay.
I'll tell you, if I may, I'll tell you a quick story about how that concept even came to me. Thinking as, you know, an owner of a house rather than a renter of a house, if you will. I was on the board of my club and we were raising the dues $20 a month, 240 bucks a year. And one of my fellow board members was apoplectic, pounding the table so hard water was coming up over the brim of the glass. And I started wondering, what's going on here? And so he went on for about 10 minutes and I was debating whether I was going to ask him this question or not. And I didn't want to, but I decided I have to. So I asked him this question. I said, and this is, by the way, I think a fundamental issue. It's not an easy one to tackle. But I said, his name was Kevin. I said, Kevin, can I ask you how you measure the value proposition of this club? Now I'm thinking I'm asking him like an open-ended, difficult question. He looked at me before I get the words out of my mouth and he said, I'll tell you exactly how I measure it. I take my 12 monthly bills at the end of the year. I divide it by the number of rounds of golf I played. If it's under 40, I'm happy. If it's over 40, I'm pissed, quote unquote, literally. I almost fell out of my chair. But I did learn at that point why he and I always had different views in the boardroom. Because if I did that math and I only measured it based on trying to keep the cost per round low, I wouldn't be at the club. I'm at the club to play competitive golf and to enjoy the social atmosphere with my wife every Friday night. So the part of the tension that we, you know, Bonnie, her question I answered earlier, part of this tension is a misalignment in what we expect, back to Rob's question and my point on why we even joined or moved in. We might have a misalignment in motivation, and that's a root of an issue. And I learned something when I was president of my club. Because I'm consensus oriented, we did make change, I'll admit it, in my tenure, a fair amount. The club's thriving, by the way. Some might argue, and do argue, that it's got to do with the fact we made those changes. But But when I first became president, I get berated, Jenny, I'm sure you know this, from people saying, hey, Ray, I got to talk to you. I have an issue or a bone to pick. And I'd meet with them. And I used to meet with them on Saturday or Sunday at the clubhouse, and I'd have a couple of beers and we'd talk. We'd talk for an hour or two. And I did it for like 7 months. And I realized most of these conversations came from people that we just had different views. We were never going to really align. And so then because at first I was trying to get everyone to see the same thing. And then I realized it's never going to happen. And I realized it's okay. What we can't have, or what we can't devolve into is a community or a club where 55% are one way and 45% are the other, kind of like the way the country is now, or 50-50, because it doesn't look good. But if it's 70-30 or 80-20, it is what it is. I literally believe this. I can't prove it, but with all what I've seen, I think of the club industry this way. It wants to move forward in conjunction with the changing norms and the evolution of society and the things we do. But about 20% of the community members are like a ball and chain on the other 80% because they don't want anything to change. I did a board retreat for a club in West Texas, and the gentleman says to me, I was talking about this concept, and he goes, with his West Texas drawl, I could barely understand him. Hey, Ray, those are what we call the maze. And I'm like, I don't understand. What's maze? He goes, maze? You don't know maze? No. I said, what's maze? He goes, maze is an acronym. I said, what's the acronym? He said, MAES. I said, what's it stand for? He said, Members Against Everything. To the question and to the answer, what we have to do is we have to have the vast majority of the folks on the page, in my mind, through data and education, to realize that nothing is static and we can't get stuck because we won't be moving forward. We have to constantly evolve because society is constantly evolving. And if it's 80-20, that's fine. That's what we do. So I don't think you're going to get everyone on the same page. I just hope it doesn't end up 50-50 or 55-45 either way, because that's problematic. And that's what happens. I'm going to be blunt because I've seen it. That's what happens in residential community clubs when it gets to that level, when half of them are saying, don't raise any dues, don't raise any fees. I don't care what the member experience is or the resident experience. You know what that is? That's the last decision that's made before the golf course that used to be only used for the residents is now available for public play, in my view. So we gotta get through education. We just gotta, and I'm not saying anywhere has to double what they pay, but I'm motivated and informed by the fact that the data shows efficiency is a very small piece of the equation. That gets in the way. And that the member experience is the big piece of equation, including the physical state of the assets. The more up to date and fresh they are, the higher the transfer fee or initiation fee in a community.
Great, thank you, Ray. Another question from Pat Hughes. How do you define residential community club, and what is the average percentage F&B loss for clubs that are comparable to Moss Creek?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. The median, the way we measure the F&B outcome financially is what proportion of the operating dues are used to subsidize F&B. The median for all 198 clubs is 10%. Moss Creek is right at the median. If you look at we've looked at real estate values. We've definitely looked at initiation fees and or transfer fees. The clubs that have larger subsidies of F&B, A, are healthier financially, B, have higher initiation fees or transfer fees, And C, it's not holistic across the 198 clubs. We don't have all that data yet. But for the communities we look at, those are the clubs that have real estate prices that appreciate higher or more than the local zip codes, and they have higher appreciation than other communities we've got the real estate data for. How do we define a residential community club? It's a club within the gates of a community. So if it's a community and it's got a gate and the club's inside it, that's a residential community club.
Thank you. Two questions from Mary Moore. First, how do clubs that are owned by Club Corp do in comparison to Moss Creek's business model? And then secondly, how do clubs with a minimum spend fare over clubs that do not have that? And I'm assuming that's minimum spend within the clubhouse.
Okay, I'll take the first one first. It's a difficult question for me. It's an easy question to answer, but for me to answer it diplomatically, it's difficult because we do business with Club Corp. Club Corp was founded in the 50s, as you all know, many of you may know, by a gentleman named Dedman, who actually, his family still owns Pinehurst. He built it over the years. It was purchased by a private equity firm in the late 90s, early 2000s, I believe. That private equity firm grew it and put it on the public market around 2013. Don't hold me to that, but it was in that time frame. I literally read the S1, the registration statement. I spent a week reading it. I read it line by line. I went through every number in it. I compared the numbers in it to the numbers in our database. When I read it, my hypothesis was that it wouldn't survive as a public company. It didn't survive as a public company. It's now owned by another private equity firm that bought it and took it to be private again. Club Corp has a few flagship properties in its portfolio. Firestone in Ohio is one of them. There's others, but it has roughly 200 clubs. There's a fair amount of them that aren't flagship, put it that way. And they might serve a purpose. Yeah, people can join. There's not an initiation fee, but their membership is very transient. They come and go. Those clubs that aren't flagship clubs, and that's the vast majority, really are competing on price as opposed to the member experience. And it's, in my view, and don't, because someone might be asking me that works for Club Corp. I don't know right now. So I'm trying to be sensitive. My sense is it's hard to compete with the member-owned club segment of the market, where the main focus is the member experience in the amenities and the quality. And I think one could argue easily that the fact that they went public and went back private is probably an indication it's difficult to compete. Generally speaking, I'll just say this, I'm just gonna say this, all right? Generally speaking, if you look across the whole industry, the more it costs to belong to a club, the better, the quote unquote, the better, the more higher end the member experience.
I'm sorry, Ray, I couldn't hear that last statement.
So I'll leave it to that. In that, I'm saying if you look at the whole industry, yeah. Now I moved in the. Looks like the Wi-Fi is a little problematic here. If you look across the whole industry, what you would observe is that the more you pay to belong to a club, quote unquote, the nicer it is. And I'm going to let someone else apply that concept to Club Corp.
Okay, Thank you. A couple of questions from Kiki De Serrano. The first one I think you've answered. How many of that mix, 198, is our HOA community owned by members? And I think you said 25%. Was that correct?
Yeah, that's my estimate.
Okay. And then she also asked, how many homes in Moss Creek do you think, or as a percentage, look dilapidated?
Oh, I've only driven, when I've come in there a few times, I did drive around a little bit.
Right.
I really can't answer that question. I don't, you know better than I. I think that the residents of the community could answer that question. I really can't.
Okay, and I'm not sure we got to this other question by Mary Moore. How do clubs with a minimum spend fare over clubs that do not have one?
That's a great question. I just did this analysis because I did a webinar, I don't know if it was yesterday, that's a blur, but on food and beverage in clubs. You know, because it's the biggest issue in the industry, is what I call a food and beverage trap. If there's a loss in F&B, which 80% of the clubs have a loss in F&B, the thought is there's something wrong. There's nothing wrong. The data shows it clearly. If you look at the financial outcome, the way we measure it, which is what proportion of the dues revenue is allocated to subsidizing F&B, it's almost identical, not quite, but almost, it's close enough in clubs with a minimum and in clubs without a minimum. There's no difference in the financial outcome. No substantive, let me put it that way, no substantive difference.
Okay, thank you. And then a follow-up from Dale Todd. You said that the 78-year-old is probably satisfied with the status quo while the 58-year-old has an entirely different paradigm. How do we deal with the fact that the 78-year-old age group may very likely be in the majority?
That is a tremendous question. I think it goes back to the same answer. It is data and education. I think that we've done enough research on real estate prices to maybe allow me to make what I consider some kind of an informed opinion or informed statement. A lot of times in residential communities, I shouldn't say a lot of times, what we've seen in residential communities, a pattern that exists in every one, is some folks get upset because the house has been on the market or they're putting it on the market and they've been basically told by a realtor that it isn't worth what they thought it was worth because their neighbor just sold a house for much more and it's a very similar house. And I'm going to get this back to the 78 versus 58-year-old because I think they're intertwined. But when you look at it objectively, that person that's putting their house on the market hasn't updated it in 20 or 25 years. And the person who just sold their house updated it 3 years earlier or 10 years earlier or whatever. So the variation in real estate pricing in a residential community, more of the variation, if you look at the community as a whole and you look at median or average price per square foot, there's no question that that varies across communities and it tracks to the amenities offered, meaning the more the dues, it's a logical thought, the more the dues, the more the initiation fees, the more the transfer fees, the higher average and median price per square foot across the whole community is relative to the ones with lower dues and lower initiation fees. But when you look within a given community, there's also variation in the price per square foot that's very wide. And that variation has everything to do with, from our reading of the data, whether the home has been updated or not. You tend to see the older members with the less updated homes and the younger ones either buying one of those and updating it or living in one that's been updated recently. And so if you have and there are communities in this situation, if you have a really a high average age and not a lot of updates been done in the community on the homes, it's more likely than not that the club amenities are also suffering. And I would define that as a stuck community. That's a stuck community. That's not a good situation. And I'm going to tell the questioner, I don't know everything. I'm not ashamed to say that. How you unstick a community like that, I don't know. But I know they exist, and I know it's not easy to unstick them, frankly. In the end, what happens is enough of them maybe move or pass away or whatever, and then it does turn over eventually to younger folks, and then that will unstick it. But it's not an easy issue. But to Moss Creek or to others that aren't stuck, the whole game is to make sure you don't end up in that situation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question, by the way, because you just gave me a tremendous idea. I just had an epiphany, and you just gave me a great idea on data that would be of great use. So thank you for the question.
Good, thanks. Thank you, Dale. Thank you. Right. Another question from Mary Moore. Does the operating ledger slide include communities with clubs owned and operated by Club Corp?
I can tell you this, it would include communities that are operated by a management company. Club Corp doesn't really, they ventured into management, but I don't know how deeply they ventured into it. They really own most of what they have. They manage city clubs. They have a portfolio of city clubs, but most of the country clubs, they actually own them. And, but there are definitely, and I could figure out how many, there are definitely a handful of clubs in that 198 that are managed by management companies.
Okay, thank you. Question from Chris Gallagher. Can you give a few of the pros and cons of allowing outside play on our golf courses and tennis courts for a fee? We have available capacity, so it would minimally impact our members and provide a new revenue source potentially.
I have to answer that very clearly and bluntly, frankly. I was president of my club, as I said, for 3 years. It's a golf-only club. There was a groundswell to put out tee times on Golf Now. I fought it tooth and nail because I know it's the beginning of the end. I would never do it. I can't be clearer than that. The community is for the people who own in the community. Why would you want anyone to come into it for 20 or 30 or 40 bucks instead of having to buy a home? I think you're just devaluing your own assets if you take that route. I can't think of any logical reason why you'd want to do that. I'm not trying to degrade the question. I get the question. It's a logical question. I'm just trying to make a clear answer to the question.
Okay, thank you. Rob, I noticed that you wanted to ask answer a question live. Is that correct?
Yeah, I had a follow-up after you're done there, if we've got time for one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Ray, back a financial question for you. Can you talk in terms of how communities, the quality of their revenue, in other words, fixed revenue sources, dues, right, as opposed to variable fees? Is that something that you measure, and is there something that we can do to look at the quality of our revenue, as this ends up being, you know, a problem for us?
It ends up, I'm sorry, I do have that data. I'm going to actually pull it up, but it ends up being what for you?
But I'm just wondering if the quality of our fixed revenue sources is where it needs to be, yep, or whether we need to have a greater reliance on fixed versus variable revenue sources.
So Rob, it's a great question too. We use the dues to revenue ratio, operating dues to operating revenue. You're at 58. The median for residential communities year in and year out is 55. It's a little bit higher than standalone clubs, which is 50. But you've got to take about 6 percentage points off that 58 in my view. So you'd probably be closer to about 52 because you're using that operating surplus that's coming through dues is really capital. If we pulled it out, you'd be closer to the median. You're around 52 or 3% in terms of the actual measure, but you're right around the median. But to your point, healthier is up here, up on the right, and weaker is on the low end.
Okay. All right. Was that it, Rob?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Let me just check again because they keep coming in. I think that handles all of them except a couple of them that were very personal, and we'll handle those via email. So any other questions from the board or any last chance ones from observers? Because Ray has been most generous with his time and we have gone way over what we promised him. We would let him go at 10 o'clock.
Mr. Himes has his hand raised.
Okay, Mike, sorry, couldn't see it.
No problem. Thanks. And first of all, Ray, thank you for your time today and sharing this information with us. You pointed out something though that a percentage, I think you identified like 10% of our operating revenue is really being used for capital. I would assume from that, and I would appreciate some commentary on it, I would assume from that we really appropriately should begin to designate the percentage or an amount of money monthly or annually to our members that we're earmarking for capital versus operating and delineate that as such in our financial records. Is that a fair statement?
Another clear answer. I lean towards that approach. It is there's a philosophical discussion there, no question. I lean towards separating it, but not, it's got a little bit to do with the culture of the club. But yes, if you ask me what I think, I'd say I'd lean in that direction. Yes, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay. Other board questions. And I know, Lanier, you might want to comment on the recent survey that you did that gave us some demographics, although it was not answered by all members, correct?
Right. We had this was the community survey that we put out, the perception survey, and it was answered by about 48% of the membership. So that's pretty high. That's significant. Looking at the age break, so I guess that goes back to one of the questions that we had. Roughly, we have 9% of the respondents. So let me leave it at that. Even though it's 58%, you could project 9% of the respondents are 55 or under. 64% of our respondents were between 56 and 75, and 27% were over 75. So since the last satisfaction survey that was done was 2017, you see a slight shift towards the younger age than what we had before. So it's, under 55, 9%, between 56 and 75, 64%, over 75, 27%.
Okay, and Ray, is there anything?
Question.
Pardon me?
Mr. Harvey has a question.
Okay, Jay, please.
Yes, Ray, we do get a number of queries and demands from members to want to know how much money people are being paid at our club, and that in their opinion, our wages and benefits are way too high I don't think without data. Is there data on residential communities as to the percentage that we pay for pay and benefits relative to other residential communities?
Yeah, your payroll to revenue ratio, operating revenue, is right around the median as well. I think that's an issue that I see. That's a pattern that exists it's the same pattern in every community and club. The thought that we're paying people too much or we have too many people. I actually had it on a slide. Very difficult issue to deal with. I can tell you this. who, just as a broad statement, when you peel the onion, there's variation in pay. We do compensation and benefits benchmarking. What generally drives compensation is the size of the community of the club. People in larger clubs get paid more. People in smaller clubs get paid less. That's it. There is variation. The folks who run these businesses work, in my mind, work their backs off. I won't use the other word. And, I'll say, if it's a standalone, not-for-profit, people can, if they know where to look, they can probably find the compensation. It's not a good, I had to live through this as well when I was president of my club. There's a point I had on one of the slides. I skipped it, but I'll say it now. These aren't my words. It's another firm that works in the industry. I once heard them cite it, and I've appropriated it because I think it says so much. The harmonious communities and clubs are the ones where the board governs, the manager and the management team manage, and the members enjoy. That's it. It says a lot. Don't let emotion get in the way of your enjoyment of the place. If we're fretting or worrying over how much people get paid, I think we're kind of missing the boat, personally. That's what I think. It's up to the board, the executive committee, the comp committee to ascertain whether people are being paid appropriately and whether or not to figure it out, but just to oversee it, not to do it. And if a member or resident feels there's an issue, then they should probably become a member of the board. But it isn't an issue in the industry. I can tell you, the most successful clubs, the ones that are doing the best, those green bucket clubs.
Ray, you froze up.
That's why they're red buckets. It doesn't work. It's as simple as that.
Could you all hear that response?
No.
Froze up on my screen. No. Ray, would you mind repeating that? Your screen froze. It must be the internet where you're sitting.
Sorry, I think when I moved rooms, the Wi-Fi got weak. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'll just say it quickly.
We're at the point where you said the green bucket clubs.
Oh, so the green bucket clubs are the ones that don't worry about these, what I really believe are minute issues. They're all about, everyone's on the same, not everyone, 80% are on the same page, that we're really here for the experience. We're getting what we want out of it, and if we don't, we'll make it better. The red bucket clubs are the ones that do everything on price. They pay less, they charge less, they compete on price. And competing on price, I'm very confident in this statement, and I have data that demonstrates it, and I'll make it very clear. I'm going again on the margin. I'm not going to suggest that Moss Creek would ever double their dues in the next budget. It would make no sense. But if you're making decisions during the budgeting process between leaning towards the experience and doing things right or cutting the price, lean the right way, because it's that simple. That's what drives success in the industry. The data has convinced me of that, period.
Okay, Ray, we have taken way more of your time than we promised. I thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and answering all these questions. If we should get more questions in from members as we post this on our website, because I think we've had quite a few observers in the mid-20s, would you answer them? Help us answer.
Absolutely, yes.
Great, thank you. And at this point, we thank you, and we'll let you go to your other meeting. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Have a great day down in the Low Country, my favorite place.
Yay, we'll come visit. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray.
Bye-bye.
And for the board members and observers, let's take a 5-minute health break. Would that be all right? So we will, it's 10:30, we'll reconvene at 10:35 since there won't be lines